The rain drummed against the windows like tiny fingers tapping for attention. David sat at his wooden dining table, surrounded by papers and blueprints that seemed to multiply every time he looked away. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he kept sipping it anyway. Old habits die hard, he thought to himself. His apartment felt bigger these days. Funny how a place could shrink when two people lived there, then suddenly feel like a mansion when you're alone. The silence was the hardest part. No more morning conversations about weekend plans. No more arguments about leaving dishes in the sink. Just him and the sound of his own breathing. David had always been the type of guy who liked things organized. His closet was arranged by color. His books sat in alphabetical order on the shelf. His work tools had their own special place in the garage. But lately, even his perfect system couldn't fix the mess his life had become. The divorce papers were finally signed 3 weeks ago. 22 months of lawyers, meetings, and splitting everything down the middle. The house went to her. He got the car and half the furniture. Fair enough, he supposed. Though nobody had warned him how strange it would feel to eat dinner alone every single night. His phone buzzed on the table. Another work call, probably. The construction company he worked for never seemed to rest. Houses needed building. Problems needed solving. And David was good at both. But tonight he just stared at the screen until it stopped ringing. He wasn't in the mood to talk about foundation problems or delayed deliveries. The blueprints in front of him showed a beautiful family. Home. 4 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, and a kitchen that opened into a living room perfect for holiday gatherings. The kind of house he used to dream about building for himself. Now it just reminded him of everything he didn't have. David rubbed his eyes and leaned back in his chair. The apartment around him told the story of a man starting over at 34. Half-empty bookcases. A couch that didn't match the coffee table. Pictures on the walls with gaps where other photos used to hang. It looked like someone had come through and carefully removed every trace of a shared life. He thought about calling his brother Jake, who lived 2 states away with his wife and kids. Jake had been trying to reach out more since the divorce, but David never knew what to say. How do you explain that your marriage just slowly fell apart like old wallpaper peeling off the walls? There was no big fight, no dramatic moment. Just 2 people who gradually became strangers living in the same house. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen, finishing another pot he probably didn't need. David had developed a habit of making too much coffee, forgetting he was only cooking for one now. The refrigerator hummed in the background, half empty except for leftover pizza and a carton of milk that would probably expire before he finished it. Outside, the rain kept falling. Cars drove by with their headlights cutting through the darkness, each one carrying someone home to their own life. David wondered what those lives looked like. Were they happy? Were they lonely? Did they sit at their dining room tables on Thursday nights wondering where everything went wrong? His laptop sat open beside the blueprints, screen showing dozens of unread emails. Work stuff mostly. A few messages from friends asking if he wanted to grab dinner or catch a game on the weekend. He appreciated that they were trying. But going out felt like too much effort. It was easier to stay home with his coffee and his perfectly organized mess. The apartment wasn't bad, really. It had good natural light and a nice view of the park across the street. In the mornings, he could watch joggers and dog walkers starting their day. Sometimes he envied how simple their problems seemed. Feed the dog, run 3 miles, go to work. His problems felt heavier somehow. David picked up his pencil and tried to focus on the blueprints again. The family who hired his company wanted to add a deck to the back of their house. Simple job, really. Measure, cut, build, done. If only everything in life could be solved with the right tools and a good plan. But as he stared at the drawings, his mind kept wandering. To conversations that ended in silence. To empty spaces where furniture used to sit. To the spare key he forgot to ask for back when she moved out. Small details that somehow felt enormous. In the quiet of his apartment, the rain outside seemed to be getting heavier. David stood up and walked to the window, watching the water run down the glass in tiny rivers. Each drop followed its own path, some joining together, others staying separate until they disappeared at the bottom. He couldn't help thinking there was a lesson in there somewhere. though he wasn't sure what it was. His reflection looked back at him from the dark window, a man with tired eyes and coffee-stained work clothes, someone who used to have all the answers and now questioned everything. The kind of person who measured twice and cut once but somehow still ended up with pieces that didn't fit together. Tomorrow would bring another day of work, another evening alone with his blueprints and cold coffee. But tonight, David just stood at the window and watched the rain, wondering when his perfectly planned life had become something he didn't recognize. The sound of metal against metal made David look up from his blueprints. A key turning in a lock he'd heard 1,000 times before, but hadn't expected to hear again. His heart stopped for a moment as the front door slowly opened. She stood there, in the doorway holding the spare key between her fingers like it weighed 100 pounds. The hallway light behind her created a soft glow around her silhouette. For a second, David wondered if he was dreaming. Maybe all that coffee had finally gotten to him. "Hi," she said quietly, her voice barely louder than the rain outside. David set down his pencil and stared. Lisa looked exactly the same as the day she moved out, but somehow different too. She was wearing that blue dress he remembered buying for her birthday 2 years ago. They'd been walking through that little shop downtown when she saw it in the window. The way her face lit up when she tried it on had made him pull out his credit card without thinking twice. "I still had this," she said, holding up the key. "I kept meaning to give it back, but..." Her words trailed off into the silence between them. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears. 3 weeks of being alone, of getting used to the quiet, and suddenly she was here filling up all that empty space again. "I was in the neighborhood," Lisa continued, though they both knew that wasn't really true. She lived across town now in that small apartment near her sister's place. There was no reason for her to be in this neighborhood unless she'd come here on purpose. David stood up slowly, his chair scraping against the hardwood floor. The sound seemed too loud in the quiet apartment. "It's okay," he said, though he wasn't sure what he was saying was okay. Her being here, her keeping the key, the fact that his hands were shaking slightly. Lisa stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The click of the latch sounded final somehow, like they'd both crossed a line they couldn't uncross. She looked around the apartment, taking in all the changes since she'd left. The missing pictures, the rearranged furniture, the coffee maker that was clearly working overtime. "You've been living on coffee again," she observed, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Old habits," David replied, shoving his hands into his pockets. He didn't know what to do with them, didn't know what to do with any of this, really. The rain outside seemed to get louder, drumming against the windows like it was trying to fill the awkward silence. Lisa walked further into the room, her footsteps soft on the wooden floor. She stopped near the dining table where David's blueprints were spread out like a paper city. "New project?" she asked, though she didn't really look at the drawings. Her eyes kept moving around the room, landing on familiar things in unfamiliar places. "Just a deck," David said, "nothing fancy." They stood there for a moment, two people who used to know everything about each other, now struggling to fill the space with small talk. It was strange how someone could become a stranger so quickly, how words that used to flow like water between them now felt heavy and awkward. Lisa reached up and touched her hair, a nervous habit David remembered well. She used to do it during movies when she was getting anxious about what would happen next. The gesture was so familiar it made his chest tight. "I've been thinking about us a lot," she said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "About how things ended, about whether they really had to end the way they did." David felt something shift in the air between them, like the moment before thunder when you can feel electricity building in the clouds. "Lisa, I know what you're going to say," she interrupted. "That we tried, that we went to counseling, that sometimes people just grow apart." She paused and looked directly at him for the first time since walking in. "But what if we were just scared? What if we gave up too easily?" The question hung in the air like smoke. David had asked himself the same thing 100 times during those long nights alone with his coffee and blueprints. Had they really tried everything? Or had they just gotten tired of trying? "I don't know," he said honestly. "I've been wondering the same thing." Lisa nodded like she'd expected that answer. She walked over to the window where David had been standing earlier, watching the rain. The storm was getting stronger now, and the drops on the glass looked like tears running down. A face. "Do you remember our first fight?" she asked, not turning around. David did remember. It was about leaving dishes in the sink, of all things. Such a stupid thing to argue about. But somehow it had turned into 3 hours of talking about expectations and responsibilities and all the ways they were different from each other. "We talked for hours after," he said. "Figured everything out." "We were good at talking then," Lisa said softly. "When did we stop being good at talking?" Lisa turned away from the window and looked at David with eyes that seemed to hold years of conversation they'd never had. The storm outside was getting stronger, but the apartment felt perfectly still, like they were suspended in a moment that could stretch on forever. She didn't say anything else. Instead, she reached behind her neck and found the zipper of the blue dress. The sound it made as she pulled it down was barely audible over the rain, but to David it seemed as loud as thunder. The dress slipped from her shoulders and pooled around her feet like water finding its level. David's breath caught in his throat. This wasn't the woman he'd argued with about dishes and weekend plans. This wasn't the person who'd sat across from him at the lawyer's office while they divided up their life into neat little piles. This was someone completely different. Someone brave and vulnerable and utterly present in a way that made the rest of the world disappear. She walked toward him with quiet determination, each step deliberate and sure. There was no hesitation in her movement, no second-guessing or nervous habits. Just a woman who had made a decision and was following it through to its conclusion. David remained perfectly still, afraid that any movement might break whatever spell had fallen over the room. His analytical mind, the part of him that measured twice and cut once, tried to process what was happening. But this wasn't something that could be blueprinted or planned. This was pure instinct, pure feeling, pure human connection in its most basic form. When Lisa reached him, she placed her hands on his chest, feeling his heartbeat through the thin fabric of his work shirt. Her touch was gentle but certain, like she was reading something written in a language only she could understand. "We always talk too much," she whispered, so quietly he had to lean closer to hear her. "Maybe we needed to stop talking and just feel." David looked into her eyes and saw years of frustration and love and loss all mixed together. He saw the woman who used to wake up early to make him coffee before work, the person who would fall asleep on his shoulder during movies, the partner who knew exactly what to say when he'd had a bad day. But he also saw someone new, someone who had spent the last few months figuring out who she was when she wasn't half of a couple, someone who had learned to be alone and discovered she was stronger than either of them had realized. Lisa climbed onto his lap as he sat in the chair, settling against him like she'd never left. The familiar weight of her, the scent of her perfume mixed with rain from outside, the way she fit perfectly in the space between his arms, it all came flooding back like muscle memory. They didn't speak. What was there to say? That they'd missed each other? That the divorce papers hadn't changed how their bodies knew each other? That sometimes the deepest conversations happened without words at all? David wrapped his arms around her and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, the apartment didn't feel too big. The silence didn't feel empty. The carefully organized life he'd built since she left suddenly seemed less important than this moment, this connection, this reminder of what they used to have. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the apartment time seemed to stop. Two people, who had spent months learning to live apart, were remembering what it felt like to be together. Not the complicated, difficult togetherness of a failing marriage, but something simpler and more honest. Lisa rested her forehead against his, their breathing synchronized in the quiet room. The blueprints lay forgotten on the table beside them, along with cold coffee and unanswered phone calls and all the other debris of a life lived alone. This wasn't about getting back together, David realized. This wasn't about fixing what was broken or pretending the last few months hadn't happened. This was about saying goodbye properly, about acknowledging what they'd meant to each other before they became strangers sharing the same space. It was about remembering that before they were a failed marriage, they had been two people who chose each other, who saw something in each other worth fighting for, even if they'd eventually stopped knowing how to fight the right battles. The rain continued to fall against the windows, washing the world clean outside, while inside, two people held each other in the space between what was and what might have been. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, new paths to walk separately. But tonight, they were simply present with each other in a way they hadn't been for years. Sometimes the most important conversations happen without a single word being spoken. The apartment had grown dark while they held each other. Neither of them had bothered to turn on the lights, and now the room was filled with the soft gray glow that comes just before evening settles in completely. The storm outside had calmed to a gentle rain, no longer demanding attention with its fierce drumming. Lisa shifted slightly in David's arms, and he could feel her breath warm against his neck. They'd been sitting like this for what felt like hours, neither wanting to break the spell by moving or speaking. But eventually reality started creeping back in around the edges. "We should probably talk," Lisa said softly, her voice slightly hoarse from the silence. David nodded, though he didn't really want to. Talking meant analyzing, and analyzing meant remembering all the reasons they'd ended up in that lawyer's office 3 weeks ago. But she was right. They couldn't sit in this chair forever, as much as part of him wanted to try. Lisa carefully moved off his lap and reached for her dress, pulling it back on with the same quiet grace she'd shown taking it off. David watched her fingers work the zipper, each small movement bringing them back to the present moment and all its complications. She settled on the couch across from him, tucking her legs underneath her in that way she always did when she was preparing for a serious conversation. David remembered countless evenings when they'd sat in similar positions, working through problems both big and small. "I got a job offer," Lisa said, cutting straight to the heart of things like she always did when something was important. David felt his stomach tighten. "Where?" "Seattle. It's with that marketing firm I interviewed with last month. Good money, great benefits, chance to work on some really interesting campaigns." She paused and looked at her hands. "I haven't said yes yet." The words hung in the air between them. David knew he should be happy for her. This was the kind of opportunity she'd been dreaming about for years. But all he could think about was how far away Seattle felt from this apartment, from this moment, from any chance of figuring out what tonight meant. That's great, Lisa. Really. You've wanted something like this forever." She looked up at him with those eyes that could always see right through his polite responses. "But," David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture she knew meant he was struggling to find the right words. "I don't know. I guess I thought maybe we'd have more time to figure things out, to see if tonight meant something or if we were just, I don't know, saying goodbye." "Maybe those are the same thing," Lisa said quietly. The honesty in her voice hit him like a physical weight. She was right, of course. She was usually right about the big things, even when he didn't want to admit it. "I've been seeing Dr. Patterson," David said, surprising himself with the admission. "You know that therapist your sister recommended? Turns out I have some issues with emotional availability." Lisa smiled, and it was the first real smile he'd seen from her all evening. "You? Issues with emotional availability? I'm shocked." Despite everything, David found himself laughing. Yeah, very funny." He grew more serious. "But she's helping me understand some things. About why I shut down when things got difficult between us. About why I thought fixing problems meant solving them like construction projects instead of actually talking about feelings. I wasn't perfect either," Lisa said. "I expected you to read my mind half the time. And when you couldn't figure out what I needed, I'd get frustrated instead of just telling you." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the relationship they'd built and then slowly dismantled. The blueprints on the dining table caught David's eye, and he thought about how much easier it was to build a house than to build a life with another person. "Do you remember that fight we had about the dishes?" Lisa asked, following his gaze to the table. "You mean our first fight?" The one that lasted 3 hours? No, the other one. The big one, near the end. When I threw that plate and it shattered all over the kitchen floor. David did remember. It was one of their worst fights. The kind where you say things you can't take back and sleep in separate rooms for a week afterward. But what he remembered most wasn't the anger or the broken ceramic. It was how they'd both gotten down on their hands and knees to clean up the mess, working together, even though they were furious with each other. We were always good at cleaning up messes together, he said, just not so good at preventing them. Lisa stood up and walked over to the window again. The rain had almost stopped, leaving only occasional drops trailing down the glass like the last tears after a good cry. I think I'm going to take the job, she said without turning around. David felt something inside his chest shift and settle, like a building finding its foundation after an earthquake. I think you should. Really? He joined her at the window, standing close enough to smell her perfume but not touching. Really. You deserve something that makes you excited about Monday mornings. You deserve a fresh start. Lisa leaned her head against his shoulder, and for a moment they stood like they used to when they were first married, watching the world go by outside their window. I'll always love you, you know? She said so quietly, he almost didn't hear her. No, I'll always love you too, just not in the right way. Not in the way that makes two people able to build a life together. She nodded against his shoulder. We tried so hard to make it work. Maybe too hard. Maybe we forgot that love isn't always enough. Maybe we needed to learn how to love ourselves first before we could figure out how to love each other. They stood, there as the last light faded from the sky. Two people who had shared everything and were now preparing to share nothing, except memories and the occasional friendly text message about holidays and birthdays. Morning light filtered through the apartment windows like a gentle reminder that life keeps moving forward, whether you're ready or not. David woke up alone on the couch, covered with the throw blanket Lisa must have pulled over him before she left. The apartment felt different in the daylight. Not empty like it had for weeks, but peaceful in a way he hadn't expected. He found the spare key on the kitchen counter next to his coffee maker, along with a note written on the back of one of his business cards. Thank you for last night. Thank you for letting me say goodbye properly. Take care of yourself. L. David held the key for a long moment, feeling its familiar weight in his palm. Such a small thing to represent so much history. He thought about all the times Lisa had used this key, rushing home from work, sneaking back in after girls' nights out. That first time she'd moved in, and they'd made such a big deal about her having her own copy. He made coffee for one and sat down at his dining table with the blueprints spread out in front of him. But instead of looking at the deck project, he found himself sketching something new on a blank piece of paper. Not a building or a structure, but a plan for his own life. First item, call his brother Jake. They'd talked more in the last month than they had in the previous year, and David was starting to remember how much he'd missed having that connection. Jake had invited him to visit for his nephew's birthday, next weekend. Maybe it was time to say yes to something. Second item, join that hiking group Dr. Patterson had mentioned. She'd said it might be good for him to try activities where he could meet new people without the pressure of dating. Just normal human interaction with folks who liked being outdoors. Third item, finish this deck project and maybe start taking on some of the more creative jobs his company had been offering. There was talk of designing a community center for the new development across town, the kind of project that would challenge him in good ways. His phone rang, interrupting his planning. This time, instead of letting it go to voicemail, he answered. David Construction, this is David. Hey, it's Tom from the Peterson Project. I know it's early, but I wanted to catch you before you started your day. The family loves the initial deck design, but they're wondering if we could add a pergola section for shade. Are you free to come by later this week and take a look? David found himself smiling as he talked through the details. Work had always been his refuge, but lately it felt like more than that. It felt like building something meaningful, creating spaces where families could make memories. After he hung up, David looked around his apartment with fresh eyes. It didn't feel like a place where someone was hiding from life anymore. It felt like home. Different from the home he'd shared with Lisa, but genuinely his own. The furniture might not match perfectly, and there might be gaps on the walls where pictures used to hang, but it was honest. It was real. He thought about Lisa, probably getting ready for work at her sister's apartment across town. In a few weeks, she'd be starting over in Seattle, building a new life in a new city with new possibilities. The thought made him happy, for her in a way that surprised him. His laptop chimed with an email from Jake. "Kids are asking when Uncle David is coming to visit. Any chance you can make it for Tommy's party? Sarah's making her famous chocolate cake, and we'd love to catch up properly." David typed back without hesitation. "I'll be there. And tell Tommy I'm bringing his present early. I found something I think he'll love." As he hit send, David realized this was the first time in months he was looking forward to something, really genuinely excited about the future instead of just getting through each day. He picked up his pencil and went back to sketching his life plan. Maybe he'd take that woodworking class at the community college. Maybe he'd finally learn to cook something besides sandwiches and microwave dinners. Maybe he'd even think about getting a dog, something he and Lisa had always talked about but never followed through on. The morning sun streamed through his windows, warming the apartment and making everything look brighter. David gathered up his blueprints and work tools, getting ready to head out to the Peterson job site. As he reached for the door handle, he took one last look around the apartment that had been his refuge and was now becoming his launching pad. Outside, the world was washed clean from last night's rain. The air smelled fresh and full of possibility. David walked to his truck with a lightness in his step he hadn't felt in a long time. Somewhere across town, Lisa was probably packing boxes for her move to Seattle. Somewhere in the city, other people were starting over, letting go of old dreams and building new ones. Life was messy and complicated and didn't always follow the blueprints you drew up. But maybe that was okay. Maybe the best structures were the ones that grew organically, adapted to their environment, and served their purpose with grace and honesty. David drove toward his work site, already thinking about pergolas and community centers and all the things he was going to build. Not just with wood and nails, but with intention and hope and the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you can start over and still build something beautiful.